I'm recording this bit. I hope that won't bother anybody because it will just be my voice and the talk. So hopefully that won't distress anybody, but I'd like to be able to share it later. But just FYI, that is happening. Okay, so this is advertised as a talk on Animal Farm and storylit game design. And it's probably worth making sure that we know what both of those things are. So storylit is a term that I and various other narrative designers tend to use to talk about a certain way of organizing your content. So having a chunk of the story or the game that has certain prerequisites, when can this piece of story happen, and has certain effects on the world around it. And the game is put together out of those pieces. So in the story that we just saw, we had a number of beats where we'd have the narrator say something, we'd have an animal come on screen and introduce a dilemma, then we had the player's choice that had some effects on the world, and we moved on, and each of those pieces was a storylit. So prerequisites for things like that might be, in this instance, something like what season is it? What resources do you have ready? Certain options are only available if you have a lot of resources. So the opportunity that we got in the game that we were just playing through, where we got to say, okay, how do we want to spend our wealth? That's an opportunity that was actually unlocked because we'd filled our hay store up. We had our maximum amount of possible resources, and that means the game is going to give us an opportunity to do something cool with those. So as a player, we're being rewarded for stocking up. Sometimes it depends on what animals are still alive, who's available to even play. Obviously, a character who has already died or left the farm isn't going to offer to do something there. And those things then in turn are having an effect on what's going on in the world. So we've built some more defenses for the farm. We actually saw that happen as well. Dogs selected to build fences. We might be moving the story forward. We might be driving out a major character. And then within each storylet, in this particular case, we also have some limitations on what choices are available, because as you've seen, the options are tied to the animals who are going to take that choice. And so if certain animals have died, their choices are gone from the storylet and don't appear again. So the way that this is structured, the game is always making the choice of what storylet to show next. The player is always choosing what to do in response. There are a number.
Are we supposed to be seeing the slides, or are we still in the preview for?
Are you not seeing the slides? I'm sorry.
We're seeing slide 81 kind of within PowerPoint.
Okay, so yes, I have. That is really weird. Let me see what is going on here. Not quite sure.
If you're projecting, maybe you're showing the wrong screen.
Yeah, let me try again. It was showing it correctly to me. Are you seeing that now?
That looks better, yeah.
Okay, let me quickly go back through what we just stepped through. So what's storylet system again, and this is what we've just been here through. So content, costs and prerequisites and effects, a little bit of a list of what those things could be. And then that kind of transition, the game is choosing what we're doing, player is choosing response. And then also, what even is Animal Farm? What are we dealing with here? Some people obviously are familiar with the book coming into this session. Some people are not. So for background, Animal Farm is by George Orwell. It was published in 1945. It is an allegory based on the reign of Stalin and the growth of authoritarianism in the USSR and the sort of events leading into that. It's a book that's had enormous effect and has been reused, reproduced, republished in a lot of different contexts for a lot of different reasons. And it means a great deal to many people in the world, not always for the same, not everybody even attaches the same ideology to it. So we'll come back to that later, because it did affect some of the writing choices. But if we actually kind of look at a timeline of what was happening in the Soviet Union for the first part of the century, there's a pretty clear sort of connection between the overthrow of the existing government, the establishment of the Soviet Union, the characters who are in place, Napoleon as an analog for Stalin, Snowball associated with Trotsky and Trotsky's followers. So there's this sort of clear mapping between that set of events. And obviously the book itself is printed just about at the end of World War II. So that's kind of the period that it is potentially covering. So getting into this project, I knew we were doing it as a storylet based project. I'll talk about why I knew that in a moment. Also, it was defined as, we're trying to bring Animal Farm to the form of a game. And there were a number of things that fed into how we wanted to do that. So obviously, you're always thinking about an intended audience in this kind of context. We wanted this to be something that would be accessible to basically anybody at the ages where they might be starting to encounter this in schools. It's something that is very frequently taught in England and sometimes in the US, sometimes in other countries. So we wanted something that was going to be pitched at the right reading level for that, where the game difficulty was not going to be so extreme that it kind of chucked them out. The story really had primacy. We wanted the game mechanics to do certain kinds of work, but we didn't want it to take over from the storytelling. We also knew that we wanted to be sharing this in a number of different countries, so we might have people looking at it who were not native English speakers. And all of those things kind of played into how are we going to present this? How is it going to feel? The possibility of maybe using it in the classroom at some point had come up, so we wanted to allow for that to maybe happen. And so we took all of that into account. We also were thinking a bit about what the legacy of prior adaptations of this work have been. So one of the issues here is Animal Farm has been used at different times to make a statement against different authoritarian governments who are in play. There was an animated movie of Animal Farm that was actually backed by the CIA because they thought it made a useful statement against communism and they wanted to kind of position it in that way. And all of those things were things that we kind of needed to be aware of and have our own set of views around. We knew that we didn't want to, we weren't trying to pad or disguise the fact that this is a very political work. At the same time, that didn't mean that we wanted to embrace all of the messages that have been sent by it by other people. And in particular, and I would say the rest of the team as a whole did not see this as a defense of capitalism against communism. We saw it as a statement about dealing with authoritarian regimes and the oppression that comes out of that, the problem of totalitarianism, problems with gaslighting and leadership that won't tell you the truth, which is something that has many different implications all over the world, unfortunately, up to the present day. And so we were pretty explicit when we sort of set this out that, yes, we are going to keep the humans who represent the kind of oppressive, abusive type of capitalism they're very unkind to their workers. And we're going to keep that piece of the message in place. But we're going to sort of explore what we can do while keeping as true to Orwell and to our own sort of concepts of what we want to draw out of this. So another major sort of factor in the work on this project came about because of the dairymen producers of this project, and in Imre, who really have been wanting to do a game of Animal Farm for many years. This had been a long-running project that they were interested in doing. They had a lot of personal connection to the text and its importance, and really wanted to see it kind of developed in a way that was going to bring its message and its story to a new audience. And working with them were the Orwell estate, who had to give permission for this to happen. And so that involved a certain amount of conversations with them and making sure that they were comfortable with what we were doing with the work. And then the studio was Nerial, who we've had previous talks actually at the IF Meetup about some of their past work, such as Reigns. So I came onto this project once all of these other stakeholders were already part of it and had already been working on it for a bit. And they wanted writing and some of the narrative design work. Nerial, of course, having worked with Reigns and other sort of further developments of the Reigns series, so the original Reigns, but then a number of other Reigns-like games. Those games are very much storylet based, very much about this thing happens to you, you make a choice, the world state changes, another thing happens to you. So that was something where kind of initial design ideas were already around that, tool chain already existed around that. So those things kind of helped shape everything from the level of personal commitment that people were bringing into the project to the Orwell estate's concern about the literary quality of the content to kind of Nerial's standards of structuring the project. All of those things were kind of shaping what we were doing with it from the outset. And then the other thing that I found humbling / warning as a writer on this project is that Orwell is a very opinionated person when it came to prose style and quality. And I was extremely conscious, even if it had not been for the input of the agents of the estate, that it would be particularly a travesty to mangle the text too much. He was a person with very strong views about what good English looks like. And I wanted to be true to that while also retaining enough of the sort of making the text accessible enough and brief enough that it would work with the other goals that we had for the project. So making it comfortable for a non-native speaker or for a younger reader to get through. So that was something that was kind of constantly on my mind. And part of the way that I approached this was to actually read quite a lot of his work before I started writing. So it was kind of prime my thinking with the prose style, and then also base a lot of the text very, very, very directly on specific content in the novel. And I'll show a little bit more about how I did that.
Do you have any last questions now, or should we wait kind of till?
Yeah, no questions. This is a good pause point for questions. So yeah, what questions are we hearing?
So someone asked, are the Orwell estate happy with the game?
To the best of my knowledge, we had a number of conversations with them during the course of its creation, and one of mine, one where I was present, but a number where Imre was speaking with them. So I think they're, you know, they were kept up on all of those things. I have not had a direct conversation with them myself since it launched. Other questions? Okay.
And Imre said they are happy, yes.
Okay, I wasn't sure if I'd seen that Imre was joining and falling out of the chat earlier, so I wasn't sure if he was actually here, but that's good to know. Thanks.
If you want to take them. So one of them says, the game is clearly meant to showcase / play the novel. Did you feel hamstrung at all in not being able to create divergent storylines?
Well, it does diverge quite a bit later on, and I'll talk more about kind of what that involves. And that basically, stay tuned, I guess, is the answer to that one.
Okay, and last quick one. Do you feel like a ghostwriter for George Orwell?
No, I mean, ghostwriter, I think carries there's a sort of implicit pejorative thing about that. The way that I approached this was partly informed, and this is going to sound unbelievably pretentious, and I apologize in advance. But my academic background, I have a PhD in classics, and one of the things that I spent quite a bit of time on in that context was studying classical reception, meaning looking at ways that people have taken classical texts and reshaped, revised, reused them for different contexts. And that kind of training gave me a lot of respect for the work that's involved in any kind of adaptation, translation, or transmediation, taking something into a new medium, which is what we're doing here. And I really see that as its own artistic task in itself. It may be an artistic task where part of your constraint as an artist is to retain certain things that you've decided to retain from the original. But all artists work with constraints. So I'll as we get on, you'll see a few more of the kinds of choices that I felt were like me choices as opposed to Orwell choices.
Okay, great. And if people drop more questions, we'll ask them at the next good break point.
Sounds good. So the whole thing is chunked up that way. So there are good pause points throughout, so we can do that. Thanks, Flo. Okay, so first thing I did, one of the things about getting onto this project, aside from the fact that it was just a really exciting, kind of interesting thing to get into, because of the pedigree of this book and the nature of what it is, that was very exciting. But I also thought, as I was rereading it before committing to the project, it is an unusually appropriate book to bring into game form, because it is very much about systems. It's very much about kind of ways that people tend to behave. It's very much about sort of groups acting in consistent fashions. And so it was sort of immediately evident that you could extract some kind of systemic ideas from it, and not every story would really yield itself to that particularly well, I think, but Animal Farm does. So as I was thinking about this, we had to start out with what are we even thinking of as the nouns and verbs in this game? And we played with a number of ideas, but one thing that sort of quickly emerged was this idea of, okay, we really want to lean into this idea that the sheep do a certain kind of thing, Boxer does a certain kind of thing, different pigs have specific kinds of things that they do, and make that a primary part of the player's experience, that you're choosing which character on your farm to activate. But when you're doing that, you know that they're going to be interacting in a particular style, in a particular kind of way. They're going to have particular kinds of effects on the world because of who they are. And you kind of internalize those things as you go along and learn about those animals as you go. And that also meant that we could have a sort of stratification of major and minor interactions. So we could say, okay, we've got certain characters, the pigs, the dogs, who are making big decisions that affect kind of the defense of the farm or its governance, and we can coalesce those kinds of choices around those characters. We've got other characters whose function is more of a commentary role, characters who do have some effect on the world state, but who are often there to offer a counterpoint or to kind of pull down on the amount of enthusiasm that the animals have for the choices being made by the pigs. And so those pieces, we knew we were sort of giving the player an option to see an alternative take on what is going on by activating these characters. And then we have certain characters who typically are not having a massive effect on the direction of the farm, but are good to select if you just want to kind of, we're just going to move forward, we're going to do some work in a minor way. And they're kind of less high impact, but that means the player has some kind of control over, do I want to do the daring thing or do I want to do the safe thing? And all of those things would be kind of tied to these characters and communicated through what you're picking there. In terms of nouns, what are we affecting with all of this? We're affecting farm resources, other states of things on the farm. How much animalism do we have? So that's represented by all of the sheep kind of clustered around the barn with the laws written on it. How good are our farm defenses? So we've already built some defenses, and you saw that in the intro. How much hay do we have in the hay store? And eventually some other things come into play. So we didn't play long enough to see this, but you can start doing some industrialization on the farm and build up a little windmill. You can also start to see the effects of decay. As if you leave the buildings unmaintained over many years, they start to get into a worse condition, and that has a feedback loop where sometimes bad things happen as a result of your buildings being decayed. So there's sort of a lightweight kind of management system. And again, it was intended to be something where the management system is allowing the player to hypothesize, okay, what would happen if I had a lot of defenses? What would happen if I had a lot of food? What would happen if I let everything decay? What if I let everything decay except for the building that the pigs are living in? And those kinds of things. And then intentionally pursue those world states and see what happened in the story as a result of that. We were not trying to make it like a super difficult management game, because that wasn't kind of what we were doing with the target audience. So it was very much sort of redirecting the system back into the story in that way. And then the other thing that these choices are affecting are, of course, the animals themselves. How are they doing? How are they feeling? How effective are they? And if you do things that empower the animals, then they're more likely to have personal options that are strong or extreme. So if you make choices that make Napoleon strong, make Snowball strong, they're going to be in a position to propose actions that are going to have a larger effect on the world. If you support Squealer, the propaganda pig, then that enables the pigs to get away with more things. So things like taking all the milk for themselves, taking all the apples on the farm for themselves, those kinds of events that are built into the timeline of the book are here kind of metered out by kind of how much leeway does Squealer have at the moment to make everybody give the pigs a pass on this. And then what that means is even when you've got the same storylet reappearing multiple times in the course of play, the way that the player experiences that, how much agency they have, what the tone and feeling of that can actually change, because you might have different animals available in that moment with different attitudes and capacities. And so you might see the same harvesting scene multiple times, but it becomes different experientially if you've run out of the animals who are strong enough to actually harvest anything, and you're having to kind of just force everybody who's at the end of their tether to do the harvesting. It's the same storylet, but it's a very different kind of arrangement of choice and consequence there. And then another important piece of state was the laws. The laws kind of summarizing what are we doing here? Which percentage of our, like what percentage of our original commitments that we made beginning about what kind of place Animal Farm was going to be, how many of those have we kept or defied so far? And that's something where yeah, over the course of play, you can wind up breaking some of these laws and replacing them with other laws, and how many of those happen kind of depends on what choices you've made along the way. So that gives us a structure to work with, and I'll pause here. Are there questions currently people want to ask about kind of that approach?
There's nothing in the chat at the moment. All right, so someone said, what's the estimated playtime?
It's usually circa an hour to an hour and a half the first time through, assuming you don't die early. And then people replay. If you replay it, it takes that introductory section out. So you're restarting at the beginning of year one, because the choices that you make before that are not significantly changing the state. So you can replay from the beginning of year one and try other things. If you could potentially ruin the farm and have everybody die more quickly than that, though not in year one, I think.
I was actually wondering how much you, I mean, I'm sure you thought about this, but how much you played with making the structure, the choices that you've already told us about, like really apparent to the player versus sort of putting them in and letting people figure it out.
I'm trying to parse exactly what, do you mean?
I can give you some examples because we've played it before. So the structure where some of the characters feel like they are just there as kind of slightly move on actors versus the major players, like that's like from what we played, that's not obviously apparent to me, and that's like a surprise to me as somebody who's played the game.
Mm-hmm.
But I find that information really interesting. So it just occurs to me like how much like you played around with like well, we have this structure and that should be really apparent, or we've tried to kind of make that subtly apparent, or just kind of let loose and players will figure out what they figure out.
Yeah, I mean, so that's something where, so first of all, it's not the case that those characters always have no, it's not like they never do anything to world state. So it's not like you're not, you have no effect here. It's just, it tends to be damped relative to some of the others. And that was something that I didn't see a purpose to explicitly signpost that fact to the players. What we did signpost was just through those bubbles that show up and down arrows, you know, you can preview what the effect of your action is going to be in the particular moment that you're in. You can also sort of over time realize that certain kinds of characters are reiterating the same types of concept about what they want to do in the world. And that was something that we very much wanted to let emerge. We wanted to let the player become familiar with what the political temperament of these characters was, rather than really, you know, making that more blatant.
Any new people, mute yourselves. Otherwise, we don't have any other questions. So if you want to keep
Okay.
going.
So given that system, we then, next stage was to actually kind of break down, okay, well, what are all of the events that are going to happen in this structure? And so to do that, what I did was take the text out of the book and put pretty much the entire thing in roughly paragraph-sized pieces into a gigantic spreadsheet. And then go through that spreadsheet and label each chunk with information about, you know, what's a sort of one-line summary of what happens in this moment, what's the earliest year that could take place, what season is it probably in, what animals are involved in it, are there things that are prerequisites for this to occur, or how is that going to affect, you know, when that paragraph takes place, how is that going to affect the story? And obviously there was a lot of work that needed to be done sort of after that point, but this had a couple of useful effects. One, it gave me an opportunity to kind of challenge the initial draft of the system that I'd made. You know, are there things that I forgot to account for that turn out to be really important from a storytelling point of view? Are there things that I did include in the system that actually are not very important because the story rarely ever references them? Are there particular characters that we really need to lean into that I hadn't been thinking about? All of those kinds of things. It also meant that we could be really rigorous about making sure that pretty much everything in the book appears somehow in the game somewhere, which is not to say that if you play the game, you are guaranteed to encounter every single one of these things. But there are very few incidents that occur in the book that have no analog in the finished game. And that was something that I was happy about, just kind of as a discipline almost, of like, let's make sure that we're properly doing this. Now, obviously, the other thing that emerged from doing that is that there are a lot of things that, you know, as soon as you've created all of those beats, there are implied other beats that you as the game writer are going to have to put in there that the book does not account for. And there are also a lot of questions raised by the story that the book doesn't account for, sometimes because it's leaning on historical context, sometimes because it's sort of assuming that you'll bring certain ideas into play. So kind of looking at, once I'd broken the book down into those beats, there were a number of questions I had from sort of the storytelling perspective. One of the big ones for me was what to do with the confession scene and how to understand that. Because for those who haven't read the book, there's a point where Napoleon comes to power in analog with the real world events. He's thrown Snowball off the farm. He's used his aggressive dogs to get Snowball off the farm. And then sometime later, he tells everybody, partly via Squealer, that that a number of people who are, or a number of animals who are still on the farm are in league with Snowball and are betraying the farm to their neighbors and working with Snowball. And a number of the animals in that moment confess that they're in league with Snowball, even though it's very contextually obvious that that is just false. That Snowball is not actually, you know, trying to undermine things, but a number of the animals confess to this and are killed. And so that's something where I found it quite challenging, you know, sort of taking the story on its own terms to figure out, well, what's the motivation supposed to be here? How are we going to get that across? And so that was something where I knew I was going to need to dig into a little bit more of why that scene was even there. Some of the other absences are things that are just given events that are shown in the story as being kind of contingent, by which I mean we see some causality that leads to this outcome, but it's easy to imagine how the story could have gone the other way. It's probably something that we do want to give the player a bit of agency over. That means that we're going to need to fill in the other outcomes, right? What if Napoleon did not become the leader? What if Snowball became the leader? What if the animals clubbed together and got rid of all of the leading pigs? What would happen to it then? What if the battles with the humans that occur at multiple points in the story had gone differently? So we've got the initial battle that we saw in this playthrough where we've driven out Jones, but there are a number of later battles with the humans as well, which could also kill animals off or have a different effect on the farm. And so we need to think about what that might do to the story. Similarly, they talk a lot in the story about spreading propaganda and getting other animals across England to be excited about animalism. What if they'd been more successful in that? What if they'd attracted more animal supporters from outside the farm? And then how else could a regime like this one end other than in the kind of you know, dominance of Napoleon and him growing to a point where he's this horribly authoritarian leader, but also essentially in league with and on par with the capitalist leaders around him, which kind of is very much attuned to the situation of the relationship of Russia and other powers at the end of World War II, but obviously is not kind of the historical position that the USSR always occupied. And then there are also some things I needed to fill in on the mechanics side. What does happen on a farm at different times of year? What difference would Snowball's ideas make? So Snowball is the one who wants to build a windmill initially. Snowball is very interested in kind of improving and industrializing the farm and giving it more capacity in that sense. So we needed to think about like, what would the implications of that be if you want to lean into letting Snowball do that? What results from that? And sort of, you know, tied into the story question of how else can the story of such a regime conclude, there's kind of the mechanical question of should this be able to have a happy ending? And this is something that we spent a lot of time talking about because the book definitely does not have a happy ending. There was kind of a question of whether if we allowed the story to have a happy ending, that would just completely tonally undercut the book and feel like it was not telling the same story at all, really. But on the other hand, you know, giving players a game where you know, there's no kind of like, yes, I won, hooray, like I turned Animal Farm into a blissful hippie paradise. You know, is that going to be too frustrating for people? So there are a lot of examples from sort of classic works of interactive fiction of narrative games that do not have a happy ending and do not promise that and use player agency in a different way. And so we look to a lot of those for inspiration about how to do this. And then another thing that we just had to fill in was, how are all of the laws violated? So the book makes pretty clear that by the time the story ends, all of the laws have been broken at some point, and it tells you how some of them are broken and what the alternative version is. But the book doesn't actually have alternates for all of them. So we had to, you know, if we were going to sort of be true to that, oh, you can break all of the laws in some way, and that's going to be showcased, we had to come up with those extra incidents. And then sort of thinking about, okay, that's all what we're getting from the book. from historical context, how much of the USSR's history post 1945 should we be trying to include? How overtly should we be addressing present day issues that relate to what's in this story? What do we think Orwell would have made of these things? And then also, does that matter? So there were a lot of sort of pieces that came into trying to think about how we extend the elements that are in the book in a way that is consonant with the goals that we set out at the beginning and the things that we had learned so far. So, to the question of historical material post 1945, there are all sorts of things from um, relationships between communist countries and sort of subsidiary countries, the whole way that the Cold War played out, and then the way that the USSR in fact did ultimately dissolve, that we considered, which of those things might we want to deal with in some way in this story. And I think the most tasteless and ill-advised of them, which I am very glad, like I have a notebook somewhere where I wrote down like Chernobyl equals windmill and then scratched out because like it was a terrible, terrible idea, which would be insulting to the entire concept, really. But there was a lot of kind of initial brainstorming about what bits of this belong, what bits don't, and how much would use of later history just overwhelm what we had in the story. So to answer those kinds of questions, I need to look at a lot of things besides the novella itself. So for the sort of contemporary common knowledge stuff, what happens on an English farm? What is a mangel wurzel anyway? There are several references to mangel wurzels in the book. I had no idea what that is. It's a kind of vegetable. I didn't know that. So there were lots of those kinds of things where I just relied on helpful web information about how to farm in England. Requiring somewhat more interpretation were sort of some of those questions around authorial intent. Like, would Orwell have thought that a happy outcome was conceivable or appropriate? And from reading through a number of essays and looking at some of the surrounding material, I came to the conclusion that probably the answer was no, that he, in particular, so one thing that I really wanted to consider was, would he have thought that the problem with this story is just that it happens to be Napoleon who comes to power, and if it had happened to be a different pig who came to power, would that have constituted a happy ending? Like, should we have had a path in the game where you get rid of Napoleon, you put Snowball in power, Snowball is charming and lovely and loves the animals, and a good thing results? Like, is that a valid variant? And reading through some of Orwell's other political writings, I came to the conclusion that no, he would not have agreed with that, that he was very concerned about kind of the corrupting influence of that kind of political power, and that I don't think he would have found it persuasive to imagine that alternative line. And so that was something where we could kind of, sketch out, okay, this is something that we feel we have some reason for the particular choice that we're making around this, and that actually would be more to the point to show Snowball having a parallel trajectory to Napoleon's, where he's got his own personality, his own flaws, he handles things in a slightly different way, but those things nonetheless take the country in the same general direction. That seemed to be more in line with the political thinking that was described there. And I know some players of the game have expressed sort of frustration of like, oh, well, it feels like this important choice like made some short-term differences, but it didn't completely shift the nature of what was going on. And that's true. That's correct. That's because the message that is embedded in those mechanics and in that sort of set of story choices is that the selection of the individual leader is not going to fundamentally change the outcomes if the rest of the system is constructed in a particular way. So you can Snowball, his sort of ultimate version of Animal Farm is different from Napoleon's ultimate version of Animal Farm, but they're both negative, and they're both negative in ways that are about abuses of power and sort of inappropriate pressures. We also wanted to to kind of parallel what was going on with Napoleon and the dogs, have the birds be associated with surveillance and watching over what is going on Animal Farm, and kind of reporting the behavior of the neighbors as kind of a spy-like system, but also reporting on their own citizens, and how that is sinister and that can build up to some negative consequences. And here, there's nothing specifically like that in Animal Farm itself, but of course, we do know a lot about what Orwell thought about surveillance states, and that he considered that problematic. So there were some things where we felt we were in a good position thematically to draw on some associated work to look at that. Coming back to that confession scene that I mentioned in the original, having a challenge with, that is based on a real event in 1936 to 38, where many people were accused of being opposed to Stalin's regime and siding with Trotsky, and many people confessed and were executed or otherwise imprisoned or treated very poorly here. And this story is what underlies what feels like the least kind of internally motivated piece of the original novella. So I spent some time kind of reading a bit about that, but I found that just the historical descriptions were not enough to kind of unpack this for me. The other piece of what I felt I really wasn't understanding was, why would people even confess in a political trial like this to something that they had not necessarily actually done? And for that, the thing that I found the most useful was a book that actually a friend of mine had recommended to me for like largely unrelated reasons, which just happened to be reading around the same time, called Darkness at Noon, which is about somebody who is in precisely this situation, based on a sort of similar kind of case of, because you sort of spent your life in this revolutionary mode and you are dedicated to the goals of this communist revolution, in the moment when it becomes necessary to sacrifice yourself for it, that becomes psychologically possible. And any attempt to describe the plot of Darkness at Noon is likely to fail, because this is a very subtle psychological portrait. So I'm really not doing it justice in trying to summarize it. But I found that very helpful. I can't honestly say that anything of that kind of interiority comes through into the ultimate game of Animal Farm, because there's really like not a good way for us to access the animals kind of at that level. But there are a handful of lines of dialogue, both in the confession scene with Napoleon and in its analog scene with Snowball, which is a sort of parallel of Maoist struggle sessions. Those where some of the characters comment about their feelings about the situation in ways that are kind of drawing from what I learned here. So it was a long journey, and it may be quite difficult for people to actually see that in the resulting story, but that was a set of things that was very useful. I also watched a bunch of Yale lectures about kind of the later stages of the Soviet Union, to try and work out what I could draw from that. And one of the things that was most useful for was determining some of the alternate endings for the story. So as I say, there aren't happy endings, but there are a lot of other bad endings. And one of the bad endings is if you get your farm into a sufficiently poor state, the pigs can decide to sell it off and live on the profits, and kind of to hell with the other animals. But they're going to get theirs, and they're going to survive the end of Animal Farm, and as individual pigs be wealthy. And this was very much based on this lecture about kind of why was it that the USSR dissolved so quickly when it ultimately did so. And a lot of that lecture was about the point that the people who were at that point running things did not have a lot of ideological commitment to what was going on, but they did have a way of retaining money and power, even if the USSR as an entity went away. And so that was kind of what informed, okay, well, what if we put that kind of outcome into the story? And then another thing that I didn't read specifically for this, but that was in the background because I'd read it previously, is Gene Sharp's Dictatorship to Democracy, which is about successful dissident movements and successful removals of dictatorships, and what an effective protest can actually look like, and what that involves. And the way that kind of came into the story, given that we knew we were not doing the happy ending version where Animal Farm is liberated and all is well, but I did want to kind of nod to some of those elements. And so that was a place where the characters of the rats, who are relatively minor in the book, get a bit of expanded influence. They get more lines, so just kind of making comments about what the pigs are doing. But they also have more mechanical effects. And their mechanical effect is largely kind of negative on the farm resources and the well-being of the farm, because they're constantly like eating your food and making a mess and causing problems. But they're also able to do things that reduce the status of the pigs. So it kind of helps if you're trying to counter the influence of a particular pig or all of the pigs, the rats are useful for that. And one of the things that we tried to kind of design into the mechanical experience of the game is that when you play through the first time, you might, if you're trying to like make sure that the farm is as well off as possible, you might actually like resent the rats or wish that you'd kicked them off your farm at the beginning, because they cause a lot of trouble. And so you might feel like, okay, I'm going to exclude the rats from my story. And they're kind of trying to play here with the tension between having some elements of your society who are not necessarily fully contributing to the collective goals, versus the value of having some people in your society who are able to identify problems and talk about them and spread dissent and sort of create a bit of a counter movement. Even though the game never shows that counter movement coming to fruition, it shows the possibility of it. It shows the underpinnings that might eventually lead to something. And to support that, there are a couple of kind of protest events in the story that are not from the original book. And then, as a kind of counterpoint to that, the birds also are, as I was mentioning earlier, creating that kind of surveillance representation. I'm actually going to pause here for a sec because I feel like I've been talking for quite a long time. So are there questions based on that before I go on?
Yeah, so we had Tim wanted to ask a question himself.
Hi, Emily. This is Tim. Can you hear me okay?
I can, yeah.
So I'll try and do this as briefly as possible. It's kind of a two-part question quickly, which is, firstly, how did you decide kind of, all right, how to put this, how to position your player and the agency of the player to the moral implications of their actions? And I'll kind of couch this in my second kind of part of the question, which is, I feel like in the last few years, there's been, particularly maybe post Walking Dead, but definitely post Papers, Please, there's been a kind of cultural trend towards the idea of getting players to engage in a kind of moral bankruptcy through game logic, which turns out to have kind of disastrous moral implications and stuff. What's your thought on this? Is this something which is good in games, or is this a kind of a blind alley that we're going down with a kind of idea of trying to trick the player? And I guess that ties into the first question, which is, how did you want your player to be? Did you want them to be very morally distant from what they're doing, or did you want them to be kind of in the thick of it?
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I'm just because there are several parts to the question. I'm trying to work out what the best route into the answer is. I wanted the player to start out their encounter with this story, and I'm going to put an asterisk here because what I mean by that is, I'll come back to it in a second. But I wanted them to start their encounter with the story being, reasonably emotionally involved, feeling like they care about these characters. The art helps a lot here, but we tried to make the characters reasonably, kind of interesting and appealing, and have funny remarks so that you feel some level of connection to them. But for that, but a certain distance to emerge over time, either, and this is where the sort of first contact with the story question comes in, either because you actually already read the book and you already have been through this once, and so now you're starting to play with the game from the point of view of, I wonder how I can mess with the book. Or because, you know, you've played the game once and now you're replaying. For that to move from this sort of empathetic, well, I want everybody to be happy and have plenty of apples kind of perspective, to something that's a little bit more systemic, it contains a little bit more systemic critique, and is starting to look at some things that might be problematic, and even to look at things that might be problematic in the non-obvious villains. And so I'll get to more of what I mean about that in basically like the next slide. But the aim here wasn't quite, I mean, I think that there are some games where there's a really fairly cynical, like, the only way to play this game to win is to be evil. Like, if you look at the McDonald's game, it's one of my sort of favorite examples of this. It's some years back, but basically you are playing as the head of McDonald's Corporation, and you're trying to have a profitable corporation. And the way to do that is to mistreat your workers, abuse the environment, sell tainted meat, lie to Congress, and bribe people. Like, that is the winning strategy to lead McDonald's, right? And that's like, having that emerge as the winning strategy from the gameplay is a pretty dark message, which it's a useful message about like, what are the systemic incentives in play that cause bad outcomes in our society. But it doesn't really leave a lot of room in it to kind of play with, okay, but where are the positives possibly emerging? And I think other games, and I would include Papers, Please to this to an extent, and certainly part of what we're trying to do in Animal Farm, are meant to leave a little bit more of a window for, even if the trajectory as a whole is to a negative place, there can be moments within that where something redemptive happens, some moment of kindness between characters happens, there is some kind of alleviation of pain or distress, or, you know, a good moment. And I think, I mean, this kind of gets into like life philosophy, but basically I think like we need to recognize the value of even those incomplete successes. We need to recognize the value of moments when we're able to make a good space for something, to be kind to somebody, to save an individual, even if those moments do not constitute a complete like revolutionary praxis, or do not resolve the systemic problems that we're all dealing with. Those moments in themselves are morally important in their own right. And losing sight of them makes it very emotionally difficult to persist in opposition in a problematic society. So that's maybe a longer-winded answer than you were expecting, but I wouldn't get as simplistic as like, this is a good method, it's a bad method. It's more, there are a bunch of roots into this. This is the kind of style that we took ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting though, isn't it? Because, you know, I think my impression with Animal Farm is it puts the player at a slightly greater distance to a kind of, you know, she'll remember this Walking Dead type of thing, but also it's also slightly distanced by the effects of your choices is not quite the same as more, you know, truly systemic, you know, sort of counting games, you know, like Papers, Please and things like that. So it kind of cultivates a little bit of distance with that. In terms of the other stuff, I guess it's kind of shaped by the text as well, isn't it? You know, but I mean, I'm not a particular fan of I guess it's a kind of liberal cynicism about bureaucracy, which is very pervasive. So it's no surprise that there's a lot of games about it, you know. And but to me, I'm not vastly interested in kind of showing the player what a terrible person they are, even though I might have just actually made that game when I made a game called Conspiracy, really. Anyway, I'll leave that, but I think it was a really cool answer, and thanks very much.
Sure.
We
Are
have
there
one more
others?
question for you. So someone asked, would a first-time player be more likely to fall into the plot of the book with some resistance to alternate paths? Having them a bonus if you know what you're doing, or have alternate paths be just as likely to happen?
Yeah, so this is something that I actually get back to a little bit more in a couple of slides, but essentially we did design it with the intent that if you follow what you might call the obvious goals, in the sense of like, I'm trying to keep my farm healthy and well, and I'm trying not to lose to the humans, then you are likely to see something that is close to the canonical outcome. There are, there can be some exceptions, but that tends to be, either you get to the standard end or you fail at farm maintenance and you die early. So the alternate, sort of snowball is in charge, or some of the other kind of variants of like, we suppress the dogs early or we suppress the birds early. Those are kind of systemic rather interventions in how the story works. Those are things that players typically, it's not that the player can't activate those options on a first playthrough, it's just that they're more likely to formulate the goals necessary to pursue those outcomes if they've already been through it once and speculated that something interesting might happen, or been led to think something interesting would happen because of, there's also an achievement system that kind of encourages you to explore particular angles. But that was very much a conscious design choice. It was like, let's more or less try to give them the book and then let them push on the book, as opposed to it's just a big open tree.
We do have a couple more questions, but I think maybe let's keep them separate for now. Ask at the next section,
Okay.
unless you're.
That's fine. Okay, so speaking of sort of questioning characters in the story, one of the things that I find really interesting in the book is that Boxer is presented, Boxer is the workhorse of the farm. Boxer works endlessly, throws labor at everything that goes wrong, is hugely altruistic, and ultimately is overworked and winds up, spoilers, but winds up dying. And winds up dying in a way that the pigs are very involved in. Like, they, instead of kind of letting him have a pasture and living out his last days, they send him off to be boiled down for glue, essentially, in dog meat. And that's a very sort of grim moment in the story that is showing us a betrayal of the pigs and how they are, they don't pay their debts and they don't respect their most important laborers and so on. There were a couple of things in the book that I wanted the game to draw out a little bit more than I was seeing in kind of people's readings. One of those is kind of Clover as an analog for Boxer. So Clover is another horse who has a very maternal relationship to a lot of the characters. She's constantly comforting people, but her role in the story is not really, it doesn't really bring out the way in which that is itself also labor. And so I wanted to, and this may be slightly a kind of a move about gender presentation, but it was also just, it was meant to talk about different kinds of contribution to the well-being of a farm that, or the well-being of any institution, by having Clover in the game explicitly be able to help restore other animals, and have that be kind of the function that she puts into things, kind of make her a little bit more, give her a little bit more primacy. She's still not kind of the equivalent of Boxer in terms of story significance, but she does have a little bit more space. The other thing that I wanted to get into was just the sort of phenomenon of well-intentioned complicity in a system that is extracting things from people. And this is, I mean, the thing about the entire book that I personally find sort of most convicting on a personal level is Boxer keeps putting more effort and energy into a system that is bad. He's motivated to do that by altruism and care for the other animals. But the fact that he does it, the way that he does it, and the fact that he is uncritical of the system means that he's actually helping to perpetuate what's going on. And there have been a number of sort of moments in my life when looking back, I've thought, I put a lot of effort into trying to keep this thing afloat. Sometimes that was because of, kind of business context that I was in or whatever else. And maybe it would have been better for me to instead look at the surrounding system and whether that system was correctly constructed. So the way that we kind of pull that in mechanically is that certain characters, and especially Boxer, can give positive feedback. I mean, in the book, he's constantly praising Napoleon and saying Napoleon can do nothing wrong. And so the way that comes in mechanically is that when Boxer says those kinds of things in the game, that beefs up Squealer's score. He makes Squealer the propagandist more powerful. And that means that the Squealer is able to unlock more and more abuses by the pigs. So basically, the more you have these characters sort of saying, oh yes, this is great, it's fine, and like it's very stressful for me, but I'll just work harder, it'll be fine. Like that actually accelerates some of the other problems on the farm. We introduced an additional character who is the Camel, that brings in some sort of alternate attitudes, some alternate sort of presentations. He's also kind of a more sort of essentially happy character in some ways than some of the others, which is something that tonally kind of felt the need of. It doesn't change the overall meaning of the book, but having additional voices that are a little bit brighter was useful. I'm going a little bit more quickly because I can get into some of this stuff in more detail if people have questions, but there's quite a lot that one could touch on. There's also a character that we intentionally downplayed, who is the character of Moses, who in the book kind of represents religious false belief and believing that everybody is going to, after they die, is going to go live on a candy mountain and that's going to be great. And this was something where it just felt like we weren't going to be able to address that in a way that would work for a present day audience and also be faithful to what Orwell intended. Because there's no way to talk about the role of religion and politics, especially in a United States context with all of the things going on there, without kind of a lot more infrastructural work. Okay, so this is the point where I shift over from talking about story and theme to talking about engineering structure and the pieces that this story is made of from a technical perspective. Are there any other questions on the first set of things that people want to ask now?
I guess we can rapid fire through the three that are up. So some of them have already kind of been answered in the chat, but you can kind of check that. So for educational/research purposes, can an IF engine record aggregate data, such as percentage of players, such as each option and range of a game stat at different stages?
Hypothetical IF engines can do that. This, to the best of my knowledge, is not, I don't believe there's any tracking built into this particular app. It's certainly possible though and other IF systems do that a lot. If you're interested in games where I know this happens, if you look at free-to-play interactive fiction games like the choices and episodes, they're all about sort of tracking player metrics for free-to-play reasons, but you could redirect the purpose of that to something else if you wished.
So someone had a devil's advocate kind of question of why should I play the game running on Rails toward an end that I already know it doesn't sound like much fun. Someone already said that's not what the game is, but I will let you.
So it's not it's not on Rails. I think, when I've said you're going to wind up pursuing particular goals as a first-time player, those are things where, first of all, you can still fail at them. You can still push at the edges of them. You can still explore alternatives to where that's going, and you can make the story jump track to be about something else if in the sense of, if you are playing through and you're already familiar with it and you want to explore kind of counter paths to it, you can do that on the first playthrough, right? It's not like intentionally the game is designed so that if you know what else you're looking for in the story, you can do that from the first playthrough. There are certain visual novels that will actually prevent you from exploring side paths until you've been through it once, and we did not do that here.
Okay, and then 2 quick questions about the game. Who did the artwork for it, and how long did the writing for it take?
So the artwork was Helen. Gosh, let me look up her last name and share that later. But she is an artist employed by Nero and did a fantastic job, I think. And we had some additional art direction on that team, but she was the person who did the primary art for it. And then the second one was what? How long did it take?
How long did it take to write?
Is that right? Assuming that is right. It was about there are gosh, I don't have my my metrics in front of me at the moment. It was several months worth of work that was not like, it was spread over a longer period than that. But the amount of that was writing as opposed to other tasks connected with writing, like I would say a relatively small percentage of the time in the overall project was actually drafting text. And a lot of it was either, the kind of research and thematic thinking this is describing, building the systems, testing systems, debugging, all of that kind of stuff.
Okay, that's all we have for now.
Cool, okay. So getting onto the storylet side, I talked at the very beginning about what storylets are. They are these pieces of content that can be activated in order to make beats of the story occur. We built these in Yarn Spinner, and Yarn Spinner, as you can see, has an interface that can look a bit like Twine. So this is the opening of the game, which is the most kind of like a standard branching narrative. This is the piece that is not repeated. So if you play through this once, or Old Major gives a speech, you play through the game a second time, it cuts this piece off, specifically because it is quite linear, and we wanted to get you to a point where you could move more freely after that. So this piece looks okay when it's presented in this kind of structure. This is what the content for the autumn season looks like if you bring it into Yarn Spinner. And what you see is there are a bunch of sort of possibilities that kick off right at the beginning where you start your autumn. A bunch of things branch and happen to kind of let you know what's going on in that season. And then you've got also just a bunch of free-floating tagged events. And these are the storylets that are being activated by conditions that apply in the world rather than by having branched into them. And then the piece at the bottom is kind of a reset node that brings you back into the autumn season state. So pretty quickly, like once I was past this piece of the game, I had pretty quickly moved to where I was editing everything in text because it was just a lot easier for me to manage that way. I was still using the Yarn tool, the engine itself, which plugs into Unity. But I was just managing all of this with a text editor. That storylet system is different from other storylet systems in a couple of specific ways. One, it's unlike a number of others, it's fully salience based, which means that the player is never selecting the storylet themselves. It's going to happen next. It's not like they can select a location on the farm and then pick I want to like interact with the windmill kind of thing. The game is always making that choice. You're only choosing to act within the storylet to affect the world state. And then the world state affects what storylet is going to be salient next. So that's kind of the back and forth communication between the player and the system. on those individual storylets, we've got a number of tags that determine when is this storylet available, how frequently should it appear, is it going to depend on other stats, other state that's in play, is it repeatable or not. A couple of notes about the syntax that are most likely to interest people who do a lot of this kind of work. It does allow us to express relationships between variables, which is very useful. I did a number of things where it's like, is Snowball prevailing over Napoleon right now? Has the player preferred one of them over the other? If so, we can have this kind of follow-up piece. We can't do a few other things. So it doesn't let us do really complicated mathematical checks. If we were building something that were a much more sort of serious management simulation, we might want to employ other kinds of sophisticated progression curves and that kind of thing. And this is not, like, syntactically, it's not really built to support that. And it also doesn't provide for the idea of casting. So some prologue-based syntax and similar logic language-based storylet systems will let you actually do things where you say, okay, this storylet is able to occur if there is any pig who currently has a health greater than 3, and then when I've chosen that pig, I'll assign that pig to the variable chosen leader, and I'll make the story be about that particular pig. So in other words, like being able to write a storylet that would attach itself dynamically to a different character depending on the world state. The system wasn't really built for that, but we also didn't really need it. So those are a few of the sort of edges and limits. And then effects of a storylet can happen in a couple of different ways. So you can actually just set variables explicitly within the content, and you can do that at any time. So not all, some storylet systems will only apply the effects at the moment when the storylet comes to an end. This would let us do that in the middle, and that actually allowed us to do things like when you're in the scene where you're seeing the laws be printed, we can actually turn on specific laws as you're going through while the narrator is narrating about that. So it's not exactly like high sophisticated animation, but it gives a little bit more dynamism to how things are being presented. And then the second point is, if there's something where we actually want to be making sure that we're displaying that consequence to the player in the moment, like, so there's little bubbles where it's saying like, oh, this is going to raise your animalism. There's a special syntax for attaching that information to the actual choice in such a way that the game can display that. And then the storylets are, as a whole, are built on this pattern that, if you watched my previous talk about storylet systems in general, is a useful reusable pattern, which is a kind of loop and grow pattern. So we're moving through these seasons. The player can anticipate certain things and plan ahead. If you've already been through a year or two, you know, like, oh, there's, potentially there might be a battle at the end of this. Potentially we might run out of food. Potentially these various things might happen. And that allows you to actually kind of plan towards those outcomes if you want to kind of use those moments to achieve something particular. So once I had all of those kind of beats, so beats built from the novella, beats added because I had worked out other sort of things that needed to be there story-wise or mechanically, the next piece was just making a gigantic spreadsheet, of which this is a tiny chunk, and looking at what the stat distribution on those was. Like, do we have enough storylets that change each particular stat? If I've got some aspect of the farm that not very many storylets talk about, like, do I need to bulk that out or get rid of that stat? Are there enough moments that are triggered off by extremes of the world state? So, I've got my hay store full of hay, that should trigger off something to happen in response to that, so that the player feels like, I made the effort to drive the world into a particular edge, and now it's reacting by giving me some either negative response or a positive opportunity as a result. So the overall sort of scale of this when it's done, this is a breakdown of the different pieces. So we had introduction storylets in that kind of structure that you saw earlier. There are a few more than you actually saw in that twine-like screen, because there are a few that deal with the opening battle scene. And then a number of storylets associated with each season, some that can occur at any season, and so on. The overall word count in the game is about 3 times the word count of the novella, but that word count does include a lot of things that are sort of controlling variables and that kind of thing. So I roughly, I would estimate that actually the amount of text in the game is closer to about twice as much text as is in the novella. And even that's a little bit deceptive because almost everything that's in our text is a small amount of narration, and then the rest is dialogue. And so there's a lot more dialogue than there is in the original book, but then not so much of other kinds of explanatory things. Okay, so given all of that, I'll pause here if anything's come up, but if it hasn't, I can move on.
We have one quick question of how did you track/update your work in that spreadsheet?
How did I track? Sorry, I didn't hear
your work in that spreadsheet.
Extract the stats from basically a lot of BB edit work. So using some regular expressions to extract stats out of the tagged storylets. This was not super automated. I probably would have automated it or made some sort of script that would parse and dump stuff to a CSV file and read in if it was something that I had been expecting to redo a lot. And if I were doing a storylet system where I expected to be continuously revising this, then making a proper tool chain for it would have made sense. But in this case, I extracted and munged the data in a slightly more by hand way because I didn't think it was going to repay the effort to build something more automated.
Okay, that's the only question we have.
Okay, so knowledge management. I'm going to move quickly at this point, but if people, basically, if you run into things where you want me to delve in more, we can do that. So several things that we needed to think about kind of with all of the content that we had. One was around using a storylet system to just kind of teach some mechanics around what can go wrong with your farm. So running out of food, for instance, is something that can have dire consequences, but we wanted the player to be able to naturalistically run into that situation. We didn't want to explicitly, linearly tutorialize, force you to run out of food at a particular point so that we could teach you about it. We wanted to let you do that and then respond to it in a tutorial way. And so a pattern that we reused in several at several points was to have a non-repeatable storylet that would trigger the first time that you got into a bad situation that would basically give you a free out. And it would say like, oh, you've run out of food, but the animals go foraging and you've got enough mushrooms to live through the day, but watch it, buddy. And then, you know, if you kind of, as a player, intentionally get back into that state again, then consequences are what they are. And that kind of sort of consequences of your choices and times when things could go wrong for you being signposted a bit is something that also comes into the seasonal construction. So you get both at the beginning of the autumn and at the beginning of the winter, there's a moment where the system will check various sort of parameters and let you know if it looks like your farm's in trouble. And so when you saw that the piece earlier that was a visualization of autumn here, all of that sort of wide set of things that can happen at the beginning of autumn, those are all sort of messages about what might be going wrong or not, or going well. And these are things that actually emerged a bit from internal playtesting. It was as we were building the game. We initially found, so the idea of winter is always hard, bad things can happen in winter, like that was always part of the sort of concept. But we found that players sometimes would get to winter not realizing they didn't have enough food stockpiled or not realizing that they were doing things wrong, and then they would die kind of feeling that that hadn't been advertised to them adequately. So we really wanted to give some signposting before you got to that point that would let you know, no, look, you really need some more stuff to get through this phase. Another thing that we did a fair amount of was variation within storylets. So if this is the first time that you've encountered this, and this is a sort of trivial thing, but just alternate text that gives you a little bit more information about what's going on there. And it will then just, you know, flag that for next time. And then other variation that can happen within the same storylet. there are choices that are available for dealing with a particular situation that, as we say, depend on whether particular characters are still in play and still available. So the dog, if the dog is not greater than 0, then it's not going to do anything here. And the dog would be set to 0 if it had either died or run away from the farm. And at that point, it would become an unavailable option. So in terms of sort of agency and intended experience, this gets back to sort of the thing that's come up several times. What is a typical experience for people encountering the story as a whole for a first time through the game was something that we thought about. What is the typical experience for somebody coming to it with sort of already in mind ways that they could change things up? What is the typical experience for somebody replaying through? And we tried to verify that both by sort of playing and also by doing some auto testing and seeing what things are easy to converge towards versus what things are more kind of edge cases that require the player to do things correctly. Now, just because you're on the canonical path doesn't mean you necessarily get everything right on the way there. You can mess up and wind up destroying your farm en route. So there are a number of different sort of death endings that are available. But basically, we did want players to kind of, at some point in their experience of this, have thoughts along the lines of, okay, well, what if I kill off Napoleon? Like, what if I decide to intervene in this? What if I kill the dogs? What if I kill the birds? What if, etc. And this is something where we wanted that option to arise organically out of the system itself. By which I mean, in a lot of sort of standard interactive fiction that's choice-based or a lot of visual novels, you will have 1 or 2 specific points in the story where you get to make a choice of like, Napoleon lives or dies. That's signposted to the player at the time. It's very clear that that is a possibility. And that's also the only place that that can happen, or maybe there are just a couple of places that it can happen. But a lot of structures like this will have sort of these tightly defined like yes or no moments at one particular static point in the plot. And we really wanted this to be something where, you know, your version of the story could be that you accidentally like killed Boxer off early on, and you also, you know, lost Snowball early on. And so the consequences of that felt very different to somebody else who had a different configuration of characters, but have that emerge naturalistically because those potentials were part of the system at a number of different points. So, you know, instead of having just that one moment where this can happen, we've got a bunch of different storylets where in theory, something could significantly affect this character's state and outcome. So big opportunities for change, especially like any kind of battle sequence, characters can be killed off. A hard winter, if you're running out of food, characters can leave. If you've built up the strength of the authoritarian system, then the authoritarian system can turn on characters and expel them from the story. And there are other things as well, where certain animals are particularly prone to losing morale and wandering off. So there are lots of different ways that those kinds of alterations can occur at different points in the storyline, just depending on kind of how you've managed the system up to that point. And similarly, that you can also gain some animals into the system. And this is why we had the camel. We also had the goat, who's part of the original novella, in our version be an outside character who can come in from another farm, because the which animals are on your farm question is so much a factor in the feeling of variety and the feeling of agency and possibility of what can I do, but also in the sort of storytelling. We really wanted your crew of animals to fluctuate and to bring in some new ones as well as losing old ones. And then the other thing that happens is that your perspective can shift to show you more and more of the pig's perspective. So there are certain points in the story where the pigs can, if you've allowed them to get away with it, move into the farmhouse, which they do in the book. There's some other points where they're kind of accruing more power. And as those things happen, once they've happened, you get different alternate scenes at key points, especially in the winter. So the winter is a time when the farm is under special pressure. It's more likely that something horrible is going to happen. If you're going to die early, you'll die early during the winter. And if the pigs have moved into the farmhouse, you start to see their deliberations as opposed to the other animals' deliberations there. So this is meant to kind of give you, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily like the pigs better, but you're seeing a little bit more behind the curtain of what they're thinking and what they're doing versus what everybody else is doing. Okay, I'll pause there for a sec.
We have no questions in the chat, and I want to throw in a quick one, or should we keep going?
I'm happy with the question from chat if people want. There's one more sort of significant-ish section from a narrative design point of view, and then that's largely it. So
Okay, well, I'll give it a few seconds, but we don't have anything at the moment.
okay, cool. If nobody's jumped in, then I can keep going. So another major factor in this was kind of pacing and creating the flow between storylets. So there are a lot of things that can go wrong with this kind of system in the pacing experience. So if you just have a big bag of storylets that can occur, and we're drawing from that bag depending on current state, you could have a season where we pull in a series of events, we get the same exact event that we just selected. And that's something that can't really, like, even by putting a lot of storylets in the system, just the nature of random chance is such that there's good odds that at some point you're going to draw the same thing twice in a row. And that really kind of breaks the player's flow and feeling of like this being a well-told story. So we wanted to avoid that. So we used a fairly sort of standard mechanism for dealing with that, which is to divide our basic events into two separate pools. There's sort of a set of A events and a set of B events. And because of the sort of breakdown of different animal types, I actually sort of intentionally made one of those pools be more about the sort of powerful governing animals and one be more about other types of animals, so that we're getting this rhythm of back and forth between them. And all it's doing is just, setting a variable back and forth and saying, okay, well, this set of things is available when this variable is 0 or 1. And then we also have a certain set of storylets in addition to those that can happen anytime. So when we're looking at pool A things, we might have either of those sets of storylets. If we're looking at pool B things, we might have either of those. And so that kind of creates this alternation now where we've got, at least we are avoiding the repetition. Next thing to tackle, though, is that sometimes we've got storylets that we really do want to fire off as soon as a preceding state has been reached. So if we've got something where we go random event, random event, random event that runs the farm out of food, random event, responds to the farm being out of food, that doesn't have the right sense of urgency. We should have that immediate response, like as soon as we've gotten into that situation. The other thing that we're seeing here is, hypothetically, this could occur even when we've got some important ongoing plot lines that we want to advance. So plot lines like the pigs moving on into the farmhouse or otherwise abusing their power, the development of the windmill, relationships with the characters on other farms. Those are plot lines where we want to be making some progress regularly on them so the player doesn't forget them and so that the game has that kind of texture that we're looking for. So to give a sort of sense of proportions here, on the autumn chart that I showed you earlier, some of these are urgent, some of them are non-urgent events, where urgent events are ones that are advancing key plotline things or reacting to extreme situations. Non-urgent events are sort of ordinary farm chores and one-off things. However, if you try to address that just by saying, all right, I'm going to give a high likelihood of occurrence, a high urgency to those storylets, so that randomly when I reach in the bag, I'm going to pick one of the most urgent pool and not consider any of the incidental pool until I've dealt with the urgent pool. Then you get this situation where you get urgent, 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 and all of the urgent stuff plays out, and then you get your incidental events. And that is also not satisfying. So what we really want is something that is bringing in urgency or reasonable, with a reasonable proximity to other things that lead into it, but still space them out enough that the player can be making meaningful choices about the state of the farm in between. And so what we actually wound up with was something where we had multiple kind of pacing counters going that controls, at a certain point, once you've gone through a couple of incidental events, then you're allowed to draw one from the urgent event pile. And that means you've got a constant pipeline of things that are important coming in, but they're not happening sort of all the time and then giving rise to a bunch of less exciting things following on them. this also could give rise to some, so I mean, this looks like a very formulaic pattern, but because the way that the storylets are distributed, you actually can have things where there isn't actually a super urgent event that's needed at the moment that you get to that kind of 4-beat. So it pulls another incidental event and so on until the point where you've got something urgent to play. And then over the course of the whole game, there's also some pacing that happens sort of over the years. The lengths of the season change. So in year 1, you've got a long spring, you've got a long summer. They're sort of tutorializing. They're mostly positive events. Over the course of the game, the length of spring and summer shortens. The length of winter and fall remains the same. And so that's partly about sort of creating this tonal sense of things are getting worse. It's partly about speeding up because there's less kind of novelty in those years in later playthroughs, but trying to get to something where it feels like the years are cycling through faster and faster, and it creates this almost kind of montage-like kind of experience. So in terms of content distribution, there are, looking just at the storylets that are tied to particular years, there are a bunch of storylets that unlock kind of on a year-by-year basis. And I can get into this more, but it's a little bit particular, so I'll skip over if people are not interested. But one of the things that is particularly useful about this setup, about the sort of design that we had here, was that it meant that post-release, there is some feeling that the pacing still needed to be swifter than it was. And that was something that we then were in a position to patch relatively robustly and relatively quickly, because we had these counters in place. We could quickly alter kind of how the system was relying on the counters in the first place, and just kind of almost like, tightening your shoelaces or something, just pull the story to a slightly swifter speed of delivery. So that's sort of a set of tools that I would recommend for people who are doing that kind of thing in the future. Otherwise, a couple of pieces of building advice around this. We did use a fair amount of paper prototyping on specific types of storylets, so things that were mechanically intricate parts of the system. I would make cards and play through the cards, looking at prerequisites. That was a good shortcut to actually getting something that worked. I did it several times during building. Other things to think about, we created a bunch of sort of open-ended storylets that we could sort of add additional material to before voicing and before localization. And that meant that when we were making some edits towards the very end, we had some additional material, some content and assets that we basically could repurpose as needed as we discovered issues with the system. And then we also relied on a pairing of automated playthrough tools. So just run through this game and see what happens and create a log, and static assessment of the data. And I showed that spreadsheet earlier, but something that I did in multiple forms over the course of the system was just look at, what is going on with these storylets. Are there persistent issues that we can just fix across all of them? And this is very much a question of, does your tool allow you to manipulate your data efficiently and effectively? So I will stop there. Questions?
So people can chime in, I think, if they want. We have one in the chat which asks if using the yarn spinner was your choice or the studio's choice.
That was the studio's choice. I believe they've actually used it before. I didn't. In saying that, I wouldn't say that that I have an objection to it. It worked fine, but it was something that was a set about the project before I came on board.
Someone else asks, how do you use automated testing effectively? It sounds like a lot of data can be hard to look through. Right.
Okay. So there are a couple of different things that was useful for. One is when we just kind of pre-release or if we're doing another build, we want to put it out there. doing a bunch of automated run-throughs as part of your sort of smoke test process makes everybody's life easier from a QA perspective. But that's not really using it as an analytical tool. Part two is doing a number of tests and looking at just what endings are they arriving at, how quickly. And that isn't a very effective proxy for what endings is a player likely to reach, because players obviously guide their actions with intent, and they're going to get to certain things much more quickly than a random walk will. But it is a way of sort of quickly verifying, like, oh yeah, it is possible to get to all of this stuff. Now, the point where it gets to kind of useful analytics, what we would do was the system would log all of the storylets that were reached and all of the choices that were randomly selected during a storylet. And that's something where just reading through it obviously is not very helpful, but you can kind of munge it to say, how many instances of X, Y, or Z are there, or are there cases where this specific sequence occurs? So there were several times, sort of getting into the details of this is a little hairy, but there were several times during testing where we would discover a bug where the bug amounted to something along the lines of storylet seems to have set the season to the wrong season. Like I was supposed to be in the middle of spring, but now it seems to have jumped back to winter or something. And that's something where you can look for a pattern in the log data automatically much more quickly than you could necessarily play towards that bug, especially if it's a hard to reproduce bug. So there's a bunch of stuff like that. And also just a certain amount of like numerical counting of things.
Someone asks if the automated playthrough testing is part of Yarn Spinner.
No, that was something that Nerial built. I mean, we had a number of conversations about like what we would need to analyze this. And one of the things that it did that importantly would not have possibly been part of Yarn Spinner was that it was actually looking at the Unity game UI as well to make sure that at each point there actually were available choices that were being shown in the UI because they were selectable and so on. So that was a custom build for this game.
Another question, if someone is new to working with storylets, what tool would you recommend, or is that more of a matter of taste?
So another important question here is what your level of engineering and design enthusiasm is, and whether you would like a prefab toolkit or whether you want to spin something yourself. But there's a tool called TinyQBN, which is built on Twine, which is designed to be something that you can sort of play with from scratch. Oh, cool. Okay. Actually, Joshua, if you're here, do you want to talk more about that?
Sure. Yeah, I don't know, about a few years ago, I made a little library called TinyQBN that does storylets in SugarCube. So you use, Twine variables as your story state, and you write. Previously, you had to write them in tags because Twine doesn't have a good way to sort of put metadata on your passages. I have since hacked around that to put it in like specially marked comments, so you can actually put the storylet requirements in your passages, which is much nicer. And Harlow, just the beginning of this month, released a new thing, and then Chris made a new release of Twine that includes that, and that's got storylets that also does the same thing. And I've looked at it a little bit. It looks pretty good. And I think from what I understand, people have said that Yarn Spinner kind of does that a little bit out of the box too. You might know that better than me. And there's also been some people experimenting a little bit. You can kind of do it with ink in some limited ways just out of the box I'm happy to talk to people about that if they're interested at some point. Yes, native to the latest version of Harlow, yeah. Which is now included in the very latest version of Twine that just came out like on the 17th or something.
Cool, thanks. I'm now able to see chat, so can look at that. Previous Storylit Systems talk. Yes, the video of that talk is linked to the Meetup page about this one.
I'll try to have a quick look and drop that in the chat when I find it.
And thanks for retrieving Helen's last name for me. I had just blanked on that and didn't want to get it publicly wrong. But yes, Odell, and she's awesome. There were a number of things where the kind of development of characters in particular, because the character voice is so important in this story, where Helen's drawings really became kind of an inspiration, as well as for the writing side as well. So.
Can I ask a question about the interpretation of Orwell, sort of as implied by the game?
Yeah.
I mean, I think you guys have done a fantastic job here, and I don't think that I would have made any of the choices any differently. But there is one thing that's sort of slightly worrying me, which is Orwell was, famous for being grumpy. He's obviously Benjamin is obviously a sort of author self-insert, and he wrote a lot about left-wing revolutions that turn into totalitarian nightmares. I mean, that's sort of his thing. And one interpretation of Orwell on the right is that what he means by that is that left-wing revolutions are a terrible idea, full stop. That the nature of people means that that will never work out, no matter how good their intentions. They will devolve into these kinds of things. And I don't think that's quite right about Orwell, but it's a bit difficult to figure out exactly where he diverges from that position. He was very grumpy. And what I worry about with this game a little bit is, because you have gone with, and again, I don't see the alternate path exactly, but the no good endings version, it seems even more than the original novel, this is saying this could not have worked, and therefore maybe the thing we should be questioning is whether overthrowing Manor Farm and Jones was the correct thing in the first place. Is that a fair read of the game, or did you think about how maybe you might have done something differently? I'm obviously yes, but what would you say to that?
Yes. What do I say to that? Okay, well, obviously, we all did give this quite a bit of thought. I certainly don't share the right reading, or the politically right side, not equals correct necessarily, reading. Orwell was a democratic socialist. He did envision an approach that was broadly on the left to properly governing society, and he was at the same time quite critical of a lot of the ways in which people sort of screw up the systems, or engage in kind of infighting within their own groups, which again is something that we see plenty of in kind of in the modern day, sort of groups that have notionally a similar set of intentions winding up extremely factionalized and very much arguing amongst themselves. So I think there were a couple of things that we kind of leaned into, and then a couple of things where where at least I thought were just kind of outside the scope of the story. So to kind of clarify that it wasn't the deal was not that that Manor Farm was a great place. Like, we emphasize at a number of points through the story sort of issues with that, and indeed, both the book and the game reflect the point that as power becomes more consolidated for the pigs, that is the thing that makes them more like humans. That it is about kind of where the structure of control is and how it operates and on what terms, and how other animals interact with that. So that was meant to to make clear that this was not like a supporting of some of the sort of blanket capitalist or more extreme kind of right-wing perspectives one could take. I think the question of what does good look like is a more challenging one, and I think there are good answers to it in theory. I mean, to some extent, I think writing the game or the book about how we get to an actually justly governed society, which minimizes oppression and protects the marginalized. Like if I had that fully worked out, I would be in a different field of work, and I would be trying to get that done by political direction, but. So I think this is quite a meandering answer as I'm trying to sort of take up different aspects of it because it's quite challenging. So I think there are, even though I don't have a full and complete perfect answer to that question, I think there are useful things that could be said about it. I think the trick is, though, that the scope of Animal Farm as a story there isn't really room in it to imagine something that's still the same story, but has fundamentally different characters who perform politically in fundamentally different ways on a large scale. And I think that would be what was needed, right? You would need a story about characters who had a different array of praxis as citizens, I think. And that's partly about you'd need the pigs not to be pigs and not to be kind of centralizing things in the way that they do. But I think you would also need the other animals to behave differently as well. So I don't think that the game necessarily indicates that that's impossible, or rather, I think what the game suggests is that from, these are the outcomes from the starting point that we have, but the starting point that we have is around basically you've got a model of political engagement that to some degree is still replicating problematic forms of engagement under Jones's control, and alternative, better ways of managing that system have not been developed yet at the beginning of the book. I think that's probably fair to say. Did that make any sense at all?
No, it did, and thank you. I think, it's clear not only have you guys wrestled with these questions, but I think Orwell also wrestled a lot with those questions.
Yeah. And as I said, like the bits with the sort of, there are some dissidents, there are some protests and things that I introduced in order to kind of nod at basically at the development of that kind of awareness as something that could happen within the system. But I didn't, I showed that timeline earlier with the sort of, post 1945, what happened, right? And there are a lot of things that, it didn't even wind up on the timeline, but that also we considered, everything from wars over other communist states to some analog of the Velvet Revolution. And the problem was, again, sort of, is this the scope of this book or not? Is this, and I actually had gotten to a point during the drafting, sort of back in June or July, where I actually had started writing a whole bunch of storylets that were basically about that post 45 stuff. And there was a bit where one of the neighbor farms, like the current farm owner dies and his daughter takes over as farm owner, and there's this sort of like negotiation around that, and it's just a bunch of things where I was trying to like use the neighbor farms to represent certain things that happened during the Cold War and so on. And I just, like, the scope of what that would need to be, it felt like by the time I was done with that, like the end product, whether it was or was not a good work of art, would no longer be Animal Farm. And so I was just like, I'm just setting all of that to one side. In the yarn code, there was an angry prefix. Yes. Okay, so that was art control. So all of the animals were allowed to have underscore emotion as a way of setting how they would be portrayed on screen at that point. It's just markup. Anything else?
This is more a curiosity of mine, but playing the game, one of the things I had a little bit of trouble kind of grokking was what it meant when the animals had the down arrow. Like they had a green background, then a green and red, and I sort of interpreted that as energy, but then I had a bit of trouble telling when it would go down or not go down. So I was curious, sort of what you had planned that to be.
Right. So it's broadly speaking that animals' well-being, but what that means for different animals varies. And that's something where possibly we could or should have tutorialized that fact better. I'm not sure, but it was something where we sort of decided to try being a little bit hands-off about it. But essentially, there are some animals where what you're tracking is really like their physical strength, right? Like Boxer, he, if you overextend him, he gets ill. There are other animals where their story is not mostly about their physical strength, but instead their story is about how much control they're able to exert. So Napoleon and Snowball, like their status goes up if you do a lot of things that they want done, right? It's like, how dominant are they proving to be? Squealers goes up if you've got people going along with pig propaganda. And then for some characters, it's a morale thing. So Molly, who is the horse who really likes wearing a lot of pretty ribbons in her mane and like slacking off, for her, it's about, how much work have I been required to do versus how many treats have I been given. And if that goes too low, I'm going to wander off and go work for humans again.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Anything else? Okay, well, thank you all very much for coming. I know that was quite a long passage through, but I really wanted to make sure that I was covering both the thematic and the mechanical sides because they were both quite important, I thought. So I don't yet know when our next meetup is going to be, but I will post that in the usual way. And I will also try and post the recording of the My Talk portion. I didn't record the actual gameplay, but that's easy enough to access. And if you liked it and you want your own copy, it is on Steam and on mobile. I feel like may have neglected to mention that, but you are welcome to have one. Thanks.
Yeah, so as the chat said, great talk. Thank you for that. Do you want to do a bit of chatting between us for a few minutes, or?
Yeah, I will turn off the recording, and then if people want to do after chat stuff, you can. I think I'm going to rest my voice, but